this is very exciting because one of the concerns I had was with the fragmentation of criteria, for example. Everybody writing their own criteria being hosted in their own server. So now with context, I can add a context to criteria and say it makes reference to this competency standard framework. And then I will be able to point to a definition that will be in a wiki or in a database that will be shared with others. So I think this is very exciting improvement. So people will still have the ability to write their own criteria in their own space, but they will be also able to share criteria and to make reference to existing frameworks. So that's really a great improvement.
Yeah,
hey folks, I just wanted to let you all know that recording has started. Let's just go ahead and dive in, and we'll figure out the context of sharing this recording more broadly.
Cut off the first couple seconds of out of context. Yeah, so we need to put a context link right at the top of the conversation to let everyone watching on YouTube know exactly where we've been and what we're talking about. So I'll get started. We're going to get into what exactly it means to have linked data in an open badge and how this enables extensions. So what you see on the slide right in front of you is the same 3 badge objects, but now with the extra JSON LD enabled information, properties included, which is a context and a type. And so this context link is a JSON LD property of the @ sign and context, and it all links to the same URL, which will be this other JSON file called the OBI context. And this will allow consumers to know that all 3 of these different objects are using, they're talking in the same space. And then the type property on each of the objects will be different. And one will say it's an assertion, another will say it's a badge class, and a third will say it's an issuer organization. And when we get into the context, and hopefully you can see the text there, it's not too small, you see that this is the abbreviation, the very top part of the context file. You can see it sort of continues below. It'll be a lot longer, containing one mapping for each property. But for the first, where we say badge, like the property of badge, which appears in the assertion to link in order to link back to the badge class, we are mapping this to an ID, which is the definition link of a definition of what it means to have a badge class. So when the badge property appears in shorthand in an assertion, someone who processes the document using JSON LD processors will see that that property actually points to something that is understood and defined as a badge class. Cool, so review of sort of what that enables. And the next thing is that this also allows you to add extensions by adding new context information. Okay, so here is an idea. An extension, as we're imagining it, is an extra property that is in the form of a JSON object, where a JSON object is a list of properties, again, kind of like a badge, where it's surrounded by little curly braces, and then for each property you want to add, there's the name of the property, a colon, and then the value. And then those properties within an extension can take any JSON data type, such as an array, a string, a number, a Boolean, true or false. So here in this little example, we're adding a course location extension to a badge class. And we'll show a actually fully working example in code at the end of the slides here. But for now, the basic idea is that this badge class has added extra properties to the badge class to describe the location of where a learning experience perhaps is occurring. And so within there, that the context link where the arrow points out to the big orange box here, that extra context defines what it means to have a course location property inside a badge object. And it will say that the definition of a course location is at this ID, and it is a type of that ID. And then we're adding a latitude, which means follows the definition at schema.org/latitude. So when we say lat, in this case, in this extension, what we're talking about is a latitude of a learning experience as defined under the course location extension. Anyone have any questions about that? I think I stumbled over my words a little bit. Cool, I got a thumbs up. We're good. And so the idea is this can be added to any of the three badge objects. So that was an example of an extension added to a badge class to provide extra information about that learning claim, you know, what the things the badge class defines. But you could also add an extension to an assertion where the information you want to add applies specifically to what that one earner has done. Or you could add it to an issuer file and provide more context about what the properties that apply to all the different badges offered by that program.
Just a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Serge.
Is it possible to add a context to a field, like criteria? Or should that go through an extension? Because
yeah, you can. I mean, you could potentially overwrite the mapping of the existing open badge criteria field, but you probably don't want to do that because the criteria field as exists is a required field in the 1.0 open badge spec. So it would probably be a better idea if you want to add a certain type of criteria to add a second, a new property that has your special understanding of what criteria is. And this extensions method allows you to add that as a JSON object, and it would have its own context property, which links out to the mappings between all the new properties you want to add and the definitions that define them. So, for example, a organization that wants to share a certain set of criteria, they may have their own specialized sort of way to represent that in JSON data, and maybe their own set of human readable URLs that it would go off to. And so they could build a set of an extension that would allow people to define that type of context specific information in the badge class, and also include a second criteria property, essentially, that would be the extension. Does that help?
But then, yes, but shouldn't we then kind of duplicate all these old fields into new fields with almost the same names? So we'll be able to be compatible with the old version of the standard, but yet be able to have a field criteria where we'll be able to define the context, so everybody will be able to share this information instead of everybody defining their criteria within their own space?
Well, so I mean, one of the goals of the 1.1, this proposal was to be backwards compatible right now. So we didn't try and change any of the existing fields. Important for making sure that existing applications like the backpack can understand badges. I think we're going to leave things open as far as to various issuers who want to create extensions in order to see what additional information they want to provide and which of those core properties they think might be useful to overwrite. And then for any extension that does seem useful to consumers, consumers can write applications that will understand them. And at the standards group, we'll provide sort of tutorials and help for how it is that a consumer may come to understand a new extension.
So I want to just jump in and suggest that, Serge, what you're also talking about, if I understand correctly, is also recognizing that there are different standards that people are writing against. And I actually think that would probably go as a pointer into alignment, an alignment field and that's the kind of stuff that GW and ANSI is focusing on, because essentially they're doing something like this that would allow people to say, we're using this standard, and that standard is what all of this other stuff is based on. So it fits within, as far as I understand it, within the framework that we're talking about right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Cool. Yeah, and I think alignment will be a very sort of fertile ground for exploring with extensions, because not all standards can currently be expressed very well by the existing alignment sort of pattern where each criteria that you want to target or alignment you want to target just is represented by a URL. Not like Common Core doesn't publish their standards, perhaps. They're very amenable to that. But with extensions, you can be able to build like a Common Core alignment extension that would then have values that are the very specific names that different Common Core standards take for the various elements of the standard that people want to target their badges to.
That would be a huge progress.
I think so too. Cool. So just another quick example and sort of an overview of what is being provided by the JSON LD properties and the extensions. And so first of all, the context link at each of the core open badge objects, issuer, badge class, and assertion, all link to the same OBI context file, which maps all of the different terms in those documents to the definitions. And then an extension here appearing in the issuer instead of the badge class, it points to its own context file, providing information about the extra properties that are being added. So in this case, the example is a badge list extension, which is a list of all the different badge classes that are offered by this one issuer that they wanted to put in the list. And it is a URL, and you'd go there and dereference it and maybe see a list of URLs of all the different badge classes you could explore. And that could help with products like directories and other organizations that want to discover what badges are available. Cool. So the idea, each badge object declares context and type. And so in order to go from publishing 1.0 compatible badge objects to publishing 1.1 compatible badge objects, issuers will need to add two properties. They'll need to add that context link to the OBI context, and they'll need to declare what type of object they're talking about. In addition, it may be helpful to add what JSON LD describes as an ID property, which is just basically the URL of the current document. So for an assertion, that ID currently lives inside the verify structure, but for JSON LD, we can also say that it's optional to add an ID property at the very top level of the document, which can help with some future goals we have around composing collections of badge objects and presenting them together to sort of get extra meaning from having badges presented together rather than presenting them one at a time. And so then the overview of each context for both the core OBI context and for each of the extensions, it declares what the purpose, the semantics, and the structure of objects of that type. So when you go and add an extension, you provide that context, and it will give consumers and other issuers an idea of what it is that you're trying to add and help them understand those properties well so that they can actually write code that will present it in their applications and will potentially apply rules to it to say that we accept badges that have these certain rules applied. Currently, you can only write things like that that would work on the core properties, but in the future, it will be very interesting to see what other information consumers want to have from the badges that they're consuming. Cool. So I'll just go over one other really quick example and then pause again for questions. So this one here is that badge list extension that I mentioned a second ago, and this you can see sort of the full code of what this looks like. And so this here in yellow is the issuer object, starting with the context to the OBI, the core context, which maps all of the terms like name, description, and contact here. And then there's an extension with a custom name, extension : badge list URL, which contains its own context link and type array and a new property that they wanted to add, in this case the list URL to a badge list object. And so we'll go over each of these new properties one at a time. The first red line, extension : badge list URL. When you process something in JSON LD, it expands each property name out to what they call an IRI, an Internationalized Resource Identifier, which for almost all cases is equivalent to a URL, or Uniform Resource Locator. So in this case, extension : badge list URL is going to go look for an alias for extension, which is actually defined in the core OBI context. And that is a URL that is like standard.openbadges.org/extensions, and then the hash sign, and then it'll append the rest of this compact IRI, which is badge list URL. So you'll get, in effect, a long URL that is standard.openbadges.org/extensions hash badge list URL. And there we're imagining like a wiki where people can go and when they create a new extension, they can go to that extensions page, define what their extension does and sort of publish, hey, we have this extension, this is what it does. The context file they'd have to host on their own somewhere, or potentially for some extensions the Badge Alliance will be involved in hosting them. But for many, I think we'll imagine them starting out as just an independent issuer, creating their own extension, hosting a context file for it, and then that's the sort of the real sort of machine-readable meat of the project. It'll allow someone to go through and dereference, in this case, list URL. The type array, the third red line there, starts out with extension, and again, an extension will expand to an IRI, which will be the same as the first part of the IRI in extension : badge list URL. And then, so you can, when someone processes this as JSON LD, they can tell that, okay, so this is, what I'm looking at here is an Open Badges extension. And I can also then tell the second link, this is the, this is the type of extension it is. And actually, so I think I made a mistake maybe on this URL. This could be the same URL here as the one that is extension : badge list URL. If you went and defined your extension on the wiki, you could then use that URL as saying, this is the type of extension that I'm adding. And then list URL, that's just the property that you wanted to add, the actual information, which then would allow someone who understands your extension to go there, fetch the list of badges that you've declared, and then add them to their directory or do what they want with them. Okay, so before I jump into JSON schema validation real quick, anyone have any questions on just sort of how this works? Carla?
So quick question, you said that last list URL, is that's actually capturing all the badges that have this extension associated with them?
No, so that would be, in this case, the issuer wanted to add a listing of all the badges that the issuer created. So it would be, as University X, these would be a JSON list of all the badges that University X issues, for example. This extension may or may not be useful in real life. We'll see how someone actually wants to design it if they get around to deciding that the issuer file should declare this type of information. There still won't be a listing of all the different badges that use a certain extension in the world. A directory project, including the Badge Alliance directory, will be able to understand extensions, and it will be able to tell what badges that are indexed by it that have each extension. But that may not be all the badges in the world. Cool. So the second feature of extensions is this option to add JSON schema validation. And that means that, say you're going to add a certain set of properties, and for all the different issuers who want to add information like this, we're going to say, okay, if you're going to use my extension, you're going to have to use this certain set of properties. But as an extension publisher, I might want to declare a little bit more specific rules about about which properties are required and what types of values they can take. This wouldn't be sort of the be-all and end-all of determining whether or not the extension is valid, but JSON schema is a technology that can go a long way for validating what we call syntactic validity, which is, are the right properties there, or do they contain the right type of values? And as a programmer, if you know that you have syntactic validity of a data structure, then you can skip a bunch of steps ahead to actually just processing that information, writing the more interesting code about understanding exactly what this information means in my context, in my application, rather than spending a whole lot of your effort just verifying that the data structure actually, this property is indeed a string and it looks like a URL probably. You can go straight ahead to, okay, I know I have a string that looks like a URL. I'm going to go try and get what's at that URL and see if it's interesting to me. So in blue here is the linked extension context. So what we were looking at just a minute ago was the same yellow file, and then this is what actually appears at the other end of the context link. So it has the, you can see list URL toward the top describes that here's the definition of list URL. And then the second half of this file is interesting. This has JSON schema. So that each JSON schema is another JSON document that just describes sort of what the structure of the extension should look like, what properties it should have, and what sorts of values they should take. And there's some sort of limited rules you can apply, like you can say that, like an example of URL, or certain string should look like a URL. It should have a HTTP : / a domain, some kind of domain, and then some kind of path after the domain. So in this case, in red on the blue document, I started getting a little crazy with the colors, you see OBI validates type. And so that says, okay, I have a link to a JSON schema here, and it is going to validate a certain type of extension. And so the URL there in red corresponds to the other URL on the other side of the page on the yellow document, also in red. So where you said, my extension is of this type. And then over in the context of that extension, the extension designer says that, okay, I have a validator here that will validate extensions of a certain type. And so you can see that this extension matches up with the type of validator that you have. So as someone who's writing code to process badges, you can make a list of all the validators that you have, and then when you come across new extensions in badges, you can say, oh, I already have a validator that can handle that type. This will allow many different people to write certain validators in JSON schema format against different extensions and against the core open badge objects themselves. Cool. So the goals of JSON schema-based validation. This will not tell you every single thing you want to know about whether an open badge is valid, but it will go a long way to helping you understand this, syntactic validity. And that, as someone who writes code to understand badges issued by many people, it's been really helpful to start working with JSON schema. To just sort of get to that first level of knowing that I have all the right data structure, and I can just start grabbing properties and doing stuff with them instead of needing to stop and just do validation at every single step of the way. So the idea, make sure you know that the badge object is properly structured. It looks like what you expect. It has the right properties, and you have things like when you expect to have a number, you have a number. You don't have a string that spells out 42 instead of the actual number, so that you know that you can just start throwing it into math equations and nothing weird's going to happen. And so the future of this is that we're thinking of sort of more model of modular components in badges. Like currently we have three different types of badge objects that come together in sort of a powerful way to mean a certain, designates a relationship between an issuer and a recipient around a certain claim about that recipient's qualifications, achievements, or learning. And so the power of all three of those objects together are much more than one of them just by themselves. And so the idea with extensions is that we can add new objects to that set of possibilities and compose them into interesting shapes that say even more and more powerfully about what a badge earner can do. And we had a lot of contributions to this work. Notably, Carrie has helped prototype a whole lot, Chris and Sunny and Brian as well, and then a long list of other people who have provided assistance, guidance, philosophical direction, as well as testing and code support. And many of you on the call appear on the list. Thanks to everyone. Cool, that's all for me, Sunny. We'll take a couple questions, and then Carrie and I can go over one more example in code, if you'd like.
I just want to say that it's a real great work, and that would be a great improvement to what we have with open badges today. I feel we have something really solid. I've moved from childhood to at least adolescence. So that's really great.
Well, thank you, Serge.
Any other questions? I think another way we were thinking about spending part of this time is also kind of exploring the different kinds of extensions. Should we do that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah. So let's just have a quick conversation there, just about like, as we were going over that. Has anyone had any additional ideas we haven't talked about of like what might be a useful extension and which sort of badge object it might make sense extending?
I can jump in with a couple.
Mm-hmm.
Go for it, Kay.
So one would be, and we do have an example of this, but we use something similar, would be like addresses, physical locations, like, an array of where, these opportunities exist. Also online locations, maybe they're just online and they're not physical. Another one would be maybe in addition to the tags, something to think about for a little while. And Carla and I have had a few conversations about it too, where currently we have this the tags, right, in the badge class. But what we could maybe have is an enumerated list of tags, so that many issuers are using the same tags. So that way we can start combining where they, what we're all pointing towards. That'll help make them more findable. Of course, like creating that kind of enumerated list would be pretty complicated just in the standard itself, but as an extension, we could have different types of enumerated tags lists and see which ones maybe get more popular. So those are three that I've been thinking about. Oh, and one more might be age appropriateness, right? Because sometimes opportunities are for children and sometimes they're for adults and sometimes it doesn't matter. And being able to signify that in an opportunity description would be pretty nice. Those are my ideas so far.
Yeah, I think the enumerated tags list sort of shows off the power of extensions a little bit, because different domains will have their own expertise and they have their own ideas of how certain learning achievements should be categorized. And so, you allow each sort of vertical, each domain to define their own set of tags, and then have, issuers who want to provide badges that are valued in that domain can organize their badges sort of by the hierarchy that makes sense, within that subject. Rather than like open badges, kings from on high deciding that these are the 7 tags that you may have, that would go against sort of what this community believes in. And I think the extension approach is more open and yet shares information when it's necessary.
Totally.
So one thing that this may already be addressed is language. I know that localization of content is really important, especially as the badges start to gain adoption across a bunch of different environments.
Yeah, absolutely. So language it's beyond the scope of entire, a little bit is beyond the scope of this exact extensions proposal. And I think that probably we're going to want to move to another open badge version where we can do specific improvements to language, to internationalization. But the JSON LD technology that we're adopting here, one of the main purposes of JSON LD is to allow to have here's a property and here's a value is the basic structure. But in JSON LD, it makes it possible to say, here's a property, here's a value in English, here's a value in French, here's a value in German. And so I think we'll need a little bit more, we might need to break some backward compatibility here and there if we allow people to say, okay, here's a criteria link in English and here's a criteria link in French. But JSON LD makes it very possible. It's just going to require consumers having, in the backpack and such, having a JSON LD processor to understand it, whereas all the badges created with this extension, as long as you put all the core properties in their proper formats, they're still going to be backwards compatible, even if the consumer software, like the backpack, doesn't yet understand like what it means to have an extension or all what it means to have a JSON LD context in there. But I mean, maybe I'll be proven wrong, and someone will create a language extension in the meantime that does a lot of this work without breaking backward compatibility.
Don Prezant here. I'm at the risk of rattling cages. I'm wondering whether endorsement might work in both badge class and issuer as separate extensions.
Yes. So endorsement, we've had, and I've been grateful for the people on this call who have been really active in the endorsement working group, we have had some really interesting discussions around what it means to have a badge endorsed. And one of the extensions coming up very soon is indeed the endorsement extension. And it, as initially envisioned by the endorsement working group, it is something that would apply to the badge class, describing, a particular sort of combination of issuer and badge class that that the endorser wants to provide their weight to, and then that would apply to all different earners. But you could easily imagine a model where one assertion is endorsed as opposed to a badge class, and an endorser wants to say that I trust this certain earner to have met the criteria of a badge, rather than issuing their own completely discrete badge, just to sort of lend their weight to a badge that's already been issued.
I think there is one extension that could be extremely useful, would be to have a issuing policy. So when the badge is issued, the issuing mechanism verifies that the conditions are met. And I think that calls, I think with all these extensions, it calls for an architecture in which we would have issuers as a service. That it is not necessarily an organization, the university, but the issuing should, I imagine, really the issuing service as being a web service that you would be able to access through some kind of API. So some organization would be really specialized in managing all these set of data on the account of the issuer, the organization issuing badges. But I think if we want to get the maximum value out of the extensions, we would need to have some kind of organization that will specialize itself in providing web service for issuing badges on behalf of the organization with the actual issuer. That would be worthwhile to think, and maybe to dismiss that later, but at least to explore what would be the benefits of an architecture where there would be specialized web services for issue badges.
Yeah, a couple of the people on this call have been digging into this issue a little bit, and I definitely want to spend some time with you, Serge, talking about it in more detail. I think there's some really interesting possibilities to move forward from here around issuing policy and like what it means to have maybe multiple issuers be able to issue a same badge class. And starting with this structure, I think there are some really promising ways that we can move forward to enable something like that, but make it very clear what's happening and make it clear that a certain issuing policy needs to be followed. I don't think everything we might want to do there would be possible under this 1.1, but we could easily move there in the future once we get into thinking a little more deeply about the ramifications. And so, like, there is on line 149 of the Etherpad, we had Tim and Carrie had sketched out sort of an idea of like what a creator extension would be, some sort of declaring the connection between an issuing platform and the issuer who defined a badge. And I think there's some interesting work to be done there that probably needs some serious thinking before it turns into an actual extension or implementation in badges.
Well, I think we could have a test. I don't think it would be very difficult to run a test. We could imagine an extension called policy. And I think if the issuing service, the web service, was hosted by the Badge Alliance, for example, not by the issuer itself, but by Badge Alliance of some trusted organization. So they will be really verifying the thing, because if it's done within if the issuing is within my space, it would be easy for me to bypass a policy, to hack the system. But if it is outside, in a trusted organization, then it's much more difficult to hack. So imagine that we could have a policy for a badge class that would be, you need to have this badge, or that could be an endorsement, in order to issue this badge. So basically, when you want to issue the badge, you send a request to the web service hosted by the Badge Alliance that you want to issue this badge, and it sees that there is this policy, so it checks into your space that you have this badge, and then you have this badge, so it will issue the badge on your behalf. So this is a kind of scenario I could imagine. I think it could work perfectly well with the state of the specification today, just an extension that we would call policy. Or is it
yeah,
bad?
it's some really interesting issues to work out.
Yeah, we did talk about that quite a bit. Sorry, I'm echoing a little bit, but you know, part of the concern is that the issuer is tied to the badge class. So the hierarchy is very where the issuer is part of the badge class, not the assertion itself. And it may be that if somebody is issuing someone else's badge, that the issuer is actually the person doing the awarding, not the person they're doing it on the behalf of. So that's also part of the conversation, we think. But we just started this conversation.
Yeah, we get wrapped up in a little bit of
it.
language.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. One more quick comment, and we can take a quick spin through the geolocation example.
I just have another quick suggestion for an extension, and that is, I don't know, indexability, searchability, whether you'd want to be able to specify the ways in which the badge could be found.
Oh, like a robots.txt sort of thing?
Yeah, so it could be that you might want to not make it searchable through Google. You'd want to only embed it in Pages, or elements of it you'd want on or off.
Yeah, that sounds great. A directive to search engines about indexability, and our directories mostly, because if we build something custom, we're not going to guarantee that Google is going to respect it from day one, but if we can definitely work within our own community to make sure that our own badge directories can respect an extension like that.
Yeah, especially with the JSON LD stuff, right? If that gets more and more adopted, then it gets picked up as an open graph and can become part of the regular search engine, Facebook, LinkedIn. All those people who are using open graph will pick up on the JSON LD, which would be great. Even the Open Badges directory, I think, would appreciate an extension like that.
Cool. Carrie, do you want to talk through the geolocation extension? And I can share a screen that has those code examples as you talk about them, in case people don't want to open all the tabs themselves.
Great, is what I just said while I was on mute. So you pull that up. So Nia and I just sort of worked together a simple example. This is a geolocation. I'll wait till it comes up here. So the example is it's just a badge class example. So I'm going to use there we go. So this would be a badge class with an extension that has a geolocation. Okay, so at the top you have the context link. This up here is actually what Nate's been working on that will live in the Open Badges world, like the standards link that was in his examples in the slideshow. And this would actually have all of the schema for, correct me if I'm wrong, Nate, the schema for, or the description at least, of what every field is in Open Badges. I'm going to pull that up
so
right
here's
there.
the context.
And this is so we can start building validators. Anybody can start building, like third parties, anyone, not just Backpack, right? That would validate badges, machine readable. Okay, so, and like Nate mentioned, the badge class would contain a link to that. And then the type, Nate, do you mind going back to the class? Thank you. The type is the badge class. Okay, and that's defined in the link above. So we have the badge class, we have assertion, we have issuer. Those are the three types currently. So you can see this is, thank you. So then we have the thank you badge, normal badge information, right? That you would normally see in a badge class, the name, description, image, issuer. And then down below you have the new extension. This is the geolocation. And the first link itself, the context link, is actually just a, that's the description, right, Nate? That just says what this is?
No, that's the actual context file, which would be the mappings. The description that says what it is the type.
I get this confused all the time, by the way, you guys.
So here's the type. Yeah, no, it'll take a little minute to get used to, but you know,
I switch those out all the time. Do you mind going to the context link just to show them what that might be? So in this example, it is just the schema. And so this explains, just like you saw with the OBI context, that this extension is geolocation. It provides a
oh, wait, I
latitude,
went to the schema instead of the context. I think we had the wrong link in there.
Yeah, see, I knew I got those, put those in the wrong places. Sorry about that, guys.
That's okay.
All right, so this is the schema. The schema defines the machine.
No, you can keep talking. I'll eventually find it.
Okay. So what the machine-readable schema, JSON schema says is this is an array, and you can have an array of coordinates. And then in the badge class itself, list the coordinates. So this only has one coordinate set. It only has one latitude.
Okay, I'm going back to the badge class to show that.
Okay. Thank you. And then the other link, which is in the wrong place, is actually just the description. So that's just the human-readable version of, this is what this extension does. And we envision that there'll be a wiki somewhere. I'm not sure where we're hosting it yet, but a wiki or some pages that would list these types of things so that you could find this. So there would be, I'm thinking about adding geolocation coordinates. Let me go look through and see if there's any extensions for that. Oh, look, we have one. Great. I'm going to follow this, and I'm going to add it just like this. And we'd have examples of how to use it. So that's a pretty basic example. You could imagine, like, I was talking about physical locations. It would be very similar, except it would be an array of addresses. An enumerated taxonomy would be, a list of the text, the terms. I'm pointing at the screen. You guys can't even see where I'm pointing, but is a list of the terms, but then the schema would list all of the terms that are allowed so that you could validate against that.
So here, I'll take a look at the schema for this one real quick.
Thank you.
Just to show you what a schema looks like. This says that the extension here, in this case, is going to be an object, type object. All extensions will be of that, which is a list of properties. It will have certain properties in it. Among those are geolocations. And that itself will be an object, or it will be an array, which would be, so you could have multiple locations listed in one badge. Say, this badge is offered at 2 different places. I have 2 different schools listed. But each of the objects that are in that array will have a latitude and a longitude property. And both of those properties are required for each location listed, and if you're going to implement the location, it is required that you actually have a location in it somewhere.
I had to mute myself because there's sirens here, but I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the schema isn't required to have an extension. Is that right? Hey, you're muted. Sorry. Could you say that again?
Oh, yeah, we're going to say that the schema is an optional component to add on to your context. If you want to just do the basic mapping between some extra properties that you're adding and the definitions for those properties, you could do that without enabling JSON schema as well. And then if a developer wants to implement consuming badges like that, or if another issuer wants to create them, they just won't have that extra helper to give them the syntactic, the structure of the document they need to build, and they'll have to be able to divine that from the examples that you've provided and the definitions of the terms themselves. But the schema is helpful, so we're going to encourage people to do it. Because it does provide these cool extra benefits, and it's not that terribly difficult to add on to an extension.
So we're at the hour right now. Does anybody have any? I want to be respectful of everybody's time. So let's continue the conversation on the mailing lists. Thank you all so much for coming, and thanks for being patient with me as I dealt with the technical difficulties earlier on with regards to recording this. We'll send out the recording. Thank you all. Please provide us with feedback, and talk to you all later.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.